Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have Mohammed Khatibi from our West Asia desk, who's joining us in our studios here in Tehran. Also, we have activist and commentator DeBar joining us from Austin, New York. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mohammed Khatibi. Mohammed, how do you view these anti-Netanyahu demonstrations that have been continuing for some time now amongst the Israeli public?
So we have been reviewing these protests for months now, and it has been ongoing for more than 11 months since the Israeli genocide began in the Gaza Strip. Protesters are demanding Netanyahu to step down, but Netanyahu is ignoring all protests in the Israeli occupied territories. And as you know, Netanyahu has been under fire even long before the Israeli genocide began in the Gaza Strip. Protesters back then protested because of the judicial reforms that Netanyahu proposed, and he was trying to evade allegations on corruption charges, and he still wants to evade those charges. So the current protests become more influential on the Israeli politics because after founding of 6 captives in the Gaza Strip dead, the protests began to grow and even escalated to strikes in the unions. And their largest union in the Israeli territories, Israeli occupied territories, Hesderot, began protesting, and Ben Gurion Airport, as well as other sectors of Israeli economy, collapsed for one day. And this can be escalated even further. So the other reason that Netanyahu wants the genocide to continue is to control the cabinet. The far-right cabinet is continuing its genocidal war because of 2 or more ministers, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and they are trying to kill all Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories and Gaza Strip. So the whole situation here is somehow complicated because of Netanyahu. Whenever there is time and there is opportunity for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, Netanyahu set forth a obstacle there. For example, about two months ago, or more, I think, Joe Biden proposed the ceasefire deal, and the Hamas resistance movement agreed to it, but Netanyahu said he wants to continue the war in the Gaza Strip, and one of the most important part of his unnegotiable measures was that he wanted to continue the war.
Let's bring in DeBar, activist and commentator joining us from Austin, New York. Mr. DeBar, give us your perspective on these Israeli demonstrations, protests that are continuing against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the failure of bringing the captives back to their families. What will these demonstrations mean if they continue? What will it mean for Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right cabinet?
First of all, whatever people intend to do with demonstrations, it generally is to just, the physical, visual, public expression of displeasure with a policy. Even massive demonstrations we have seen over the last couple decades don't necessarily affect policy. You go to February 15th, 2003, when the largest anti-war protests in the world, around the world, millions of people went out in the street to tell Bush and company, do not invade Iraq. 3.5 weeks later, they invaded Iraq. There haven't been any demonstrations on that part since. Also, we see the street demonstrations are easily manipulated by the behind-the-scenes powers. The Maidan is a good example of that, where what looks like a popular uprising turns out to be engineered by the CIA. And so when we're looking at what's happening with the Netanyahu demonstrations, there's the intentions of the demonstrators, which clearly is to express displeasure with the policies. Their own family members were led to believe, first of all, that they were entitled to be on that land in the first place that belongs to Palestinians. And secondly, somehow Netanyahu was going to wrap his arms around them and make them safe on this land that they had no business being on. Then when they were taken and removed from the land, and some were killed in the process and others being held, that Netanyahu was going to blow up a lot of Palestinians and clear a lot of Gaza of Palestinians, and somehow this would return these people home. And now some of them have been coming home in body bags. Meanwhile, he's got his own personal agenda that's clicking away also, because he's got to extend his time as prime minister as far out into the future as he can, knowing the moment he's no longer prime minister, he's no longer has immunity from the various criminal prosecutions he's facing. So what this turns into, we don't know. We assume the people protesting are expressing their displeasure with the Israeli government and their policies. We also assume that Netanyahu is going to continue to be given free rein from the Obama administration at the very least. So this will be going on until January. And we also know that people on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank and elsewhere in the region are not sitting on their hands while this is all being done to them. There will be responses again here and there, and who knows what flows from that.
Staying with you, Mr. DeBar, as you mentioned, the Israeli Prime Minister is trying to keep his head above water as long as he can by refusing a ceasefire and prolonging this war, murdering more innocent women and children. But what these demonstrations, the anti-Netanyahu demonstrations, also show is that this has been a failure, this genocidal war, in terms of the military campaign and the military goals that were stated initially by the likes of Netanyahu. It's been a failure for the Israelis across the board, hasn't it?
And more so, I think it has planted the seeds for a complete failure. In other words, I think eventually, and not so far in the future, a complete collapse of the Israeli experiment, or whatever you want to refer to it as. There will be a one-state solution. I think the state's going to be Palestine. What has happened is that this whole project of ethnic cleansing has been laid bare in front of the world. Every possible argument in favor of such a policy was given clear channel in the Western media for decades. It has now reached its ultimate fulfillment in front of everyone, and it lies naked in front of them as barbaric mass murder. And I don't think there's any public relations gimmick that can be presented to undo that at this point, that people are going to have to reckon with the fact that they've allowed this to happen this far. And we're not even 80 years out of World War II and the founding of the United Nations, when this was supposed to be never again. And here we are. And also here we are looking at a war between the two allies of World War II less than 80 years later. I think that the situation facing the people in that region on all sides has reached a point where reality has to be faced, or there's going to be hell to pay.
Mohammed Khatibi, give us your thoughts on the comments just made by Mr. DeBar. Has the criminal and murderous nature of the Israeli regime now been exposed to a point of no return?
Yes, actually, the Netanyahu regime and the Israeli regime is continuing to kill Palestinians, and the goals that they have announced are failing one by one. They announced that they want to defeat Hamas, but everyone knows that Hamas cannot be defeated, because Hamas is not an is not a military force. Hamas is an ideology. Hamas, whenever Israel kills a Palestinian who supports Hamas, two other Palestinians join Hamas and join the ideology of resistance. The resistance movement in the Palestinian territories is growing. We are seeing this not just only in the Gaza Strip, but also the occupied West Bank. The operations against the Israeli regime in the occupied West Bank is growing and continuously spreading across the occupied Palestinian territories. For months, Israel heightened security and measures to prevent anti-Israel operations, but it has failed, and time and again we see operations at heart of Israeli occupied territories. And also, the regime wants to continue its genocidal war in the Gaza Strip because, as the other guests said, Netanyahu wants to be in power. Netanyahu wants his far-right coalition to be in place. So many Israelis are against Netanyahu, not just because of the genocide in the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu has a long list of corruption charges, and everyone in the Israeli occupied territories are against him, and he is trying to make obstacles in ceasefire because he wants to stay in power. The main points that he is insisting on, for example, the Philadelphia corridor, is just nonsense. Israel has been controlling and watching the corridor for more than a decade after watching the corridor with Egypt. With the aid of Egypt, Netanyahu and his coalition cabinet watched over it for some time. And
yeah, thanks a lot. We're going to leave it there. Press TV's West Asia desk expert Mohammed Khatibi joining us in our studio here in Tehran, and thanks to activist and commentator Mr. Don DeBar speaking to us from Austin, New York. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review. But stick around, we've got plenty more to come here on Press TV. See you soon.